We are going to turn to the book of Numbers, chapter 16. Okay. Numbers chapter 16. And this will be the next lesson as we've been looking at the Bible story of Aaron. Aaron is the first high priest, and we have come to chapter 16 of Numbers, looking at what we'll call, and we'll borrow this title from another passage of Scripture, we'll call it the Gainsaying of Korah. Now, where do we get that title? Of course, that comes from the book of Jude. We went through the book of Jude a couple of years ago, I believe that it was, and that book dealt really with the subject of apostasy. And he dealt with how God has dealt with apostasy in the past. He spoke there of three examples in the book of Jude. He wrote about Cain, he wrote about Balaam, and then what he called the Gainsaying of Korah. Examples in the Old Testament of how God dealt with apostates. Numbers chapter 16, of course, all the way through our study so far, about 4 or 5 weeks, Aaron has been established as high priest. Israel, of course, has started their journeying. And this chapter recounts a story where Aaron and Moses are challenged as far as the authority that they have. We're not going to go back and establish every verse that led up to this point. We know that Aaron and Moses have been delegated and designated authorities amongst the tribes of Israel. Moses is the one that led them out from the land of Egypt. Aaron has been established as high priest. We started our study with the transition from the firstborn to the Levites, that the Levites had been separated and dedicated to the service of God. Aaron and his sons among them were established as priests. But this passage here tells a story of pride, a story of discontent, forgetfulness, and then, of course, it ends a familiar story of judgment. Let's begin here. Let's look at verse number 1. Numbers chapter 16, we'll start with verse number 1, and our first thought will just be the rebellion against Aaron and Moses. Verse number 1 says, Now Korah, the son of Izhar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, and Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and On, the sons of Peleth, sons of Reuben, took men. And they rose up before Moses with certain of the children of Israel, 250 princes of the assembly, famous in the congregation, men of renown. And they gathered themselves together against Moses and against Aaron, and said unto them, Ye take too much upon you, seeing all the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Wherefore then lift ye up yourselves above the congregation of the Lord. Let's start there with those first 3 verses. Of course, in verse number 1, it mentions Korah. Korah is the leader of this gang. Now, we remember from what we established in Exodus chapter 6, when the Bible was establishing the lineage of men like Moses and Aaron, we remember that they were from the tribe of Levi, and Levi had 3 sons. One of them was a man by the name of Kohath. Kohath had a son named Amram, who was the father of Moses and Aaron. Now, Kohath also had a son here in verse number 1, it says Izhar. And then Korah was the son of Izhar. Now, combine those together, of course, this means that whoever this Korah is, he's their cousin, right? They share the same grandfather. Whoever Kohath was, this son of Levi, that was their grandfather. Korah his dad and Moses' dad were brothers. That's how the family lineage works out between these two. It wasn't just a random rebellion. So it leads us, there are other men that are mentioned here, and of course they gather with 250 different princes, but Korah appears to be the instigator of this trouble. Sometimes family are the hardest ones to please, and Korah starts this rebellion here against his own family. Now again, not alone. With them, it says that there are 250 princes. Everything that is given to us in verse number 2 signifies that these were important people. These were not just, no name, general, just your everyday common man of the tribes of Israel. There are 3 different things that are mentioned in verse number 2. It calls them princes. It says that they were famous, and it says that they were men of renown. So you are led to believe by everything that is mentioned in verse 2, these are important men. And I say important men in air quotes. That's not to be silly, and that's not to be obnoxious about that. That's how they are viewed, important men. And verse 3 really begins the story where they gather themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. The Bible tells us here that what they say is against Moses and Aaron. It's not just that they say these things to Moses, but with the intent of being antagonistic, with the approach of being against Moses and Aaron. Here's what they say. You take too much upon you, seeing all the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Wherefore then, lift ye up yourselves above the congregation of the Lord. There are 3 different things that I think that you see from their argument here. There's 3 different things that are important in verse number 3. The first thing is that they challenge Moses and Aaron's authority. They say, you have too much authority. This is too much authority invested in too few a people. Moses, Aaron, ye take too much upon you. That's just too much. You guys have concentrated all authority and all responsibility in a small number of people. So that's the first challenge to Moses and Aaron. They know that they just have too much authority. This is a common aggravation among men, and it would be common. It would be common to us, wouldn't it? If we saw a heavy amount of authority concentrated in a small group of people, there is almost a natural reaction to buck against that. Of course, it doesn't change the fact that this is the way that the Lord had established this setup. But you guys got too much authority. You all need to be sharing some of this authority. That's the first thing. The second thing is that they make an accusation against them that they had lifted themselves up. It says at the end of verse number 3, wherefore then lift ye up yourselves above the congregation of the Lord. You guys have basically taken this upon yourselves. Now, you and I both know that is not the case. You and I, from what we've read, we know that God chose Moses. God called Moses as the deliverer of Israel. We know that God told Moses to deliver them from Egypt. We know that Aaron and his sons have been established as the priests in Israel. We know that all of this was ordained by God, and yet part of their accusation is that not only do you take too much authority, not only do you control too much authority among the people, we're not sure this was God's call. Ye are lifting yourselves up. There's a thought there that they're not convinced that this is God's way. They're more convinced that you all did this yourselves. Yes, Moses led us out. How convenient that Moses is the political leader, and how convenient that the spiritual leader just happens to be Moses' brother, right? You did this yourselves, they say. Wherefore then lift ye yourselves up above the congregation. Now, I'm going to read a verse from over in the book of Hebrews Hebrews chapter 5. Hebrews chapter 5 and verse number 1, the Bible says, "For every high priest taken from among men is ordained for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins, who can have compassion on the ignorant and on them that are out of the way, for that he himself also is compassed with infirmity. And by reason hereof he ought, as for the people, so also for himself, to offer for sins." Here's the key verse, Hebrews 5, verse 4. "And no man taketh this honor unto himself, but he that is called of God, as was Aaron." This passage makes it clear that the priesthood was such a position that this was not something that men entered into lightly. This was not something that men would have entered into or did enter in of their own will, of their own accord. This was something that men did not take upon themselves. This was a calling of God. What Korah and his company say then here in our text in verse number 3, "Wherefore then lift ye yourselves above the congregation of the Lord," that is not accurate to the way that this was set up. This was not accurate to the way that the authority was established. Aaron was called by God. Moses did not conceive of authority and, well, of course, to consolidate power, I'm going to put all the spiritual authority in my brother. No, this was something that was set up and established by the Lord. No man entered into this office of his own, but he that is called of God, as was Aaron. So the second part of their argument, that not only do you have too much authority, but you have lifted yourselves up above the congregation, that's not correct. It's not correct according to the facts. When you're frustrated, I get it, when you're frustrated, and as is common among men, when we are frustrated, when we're angry, when we feel slighted, a little embellishment of the facts, a little not as being honest with the facts seems to go with that. That's the second thing. Now, let's look at our text again, number 16, verse 3, and I'll tell you the third thing that they make part of their argument is, we are all holy. Numbers chapter 16, verse 3, "Ye take too much upon you, seeing all the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them." Korah and his company come with the argument that, Moses, Aaron, the authority that you're exercising, that's something that we could all do, right? Why can't Korah and his sons sacrifice? Why can't people from these other tribes, why can't they sacrifice? And their argument is, we're all Jews, we're all holy, we're all Israel, God is among us, every one of us. To think that you are the only ones that could do these jobs, Korah and his company say, that doesn't seem right. We're all holy. We should all be able to do these things if God is among us. Now, there's a distinct usage of the word holy, and you always have to make sure that you define your terms correctly. Now, the word holy obviously can mean sinless. It can mean perfect, no sin. But in the distinct usage that it is more often used, it means separated. It means sanctified. Now, what they misunderstand there is the usage of the term separation or the term sanctification, being separated. Was Israel as a whole holy? Yes. Israel as a whole was distinct. Israel was different. They were separated. They were a sanctified nation. The heritage that they had as the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they were different than the Egyptians. They were different than the Canaanites. They were different than the Philistines. They were different than all of the other nations. Okay? In that sense, yes, they were holy. They were unique. They were separated. But that is not the distinction that God makes when it comes to the priesthood, because there was, even within Israel, a sanctified or a set apart family for those specific purposes. You see, what they wanted to do was take the term holy and put it under a much bigger umbrella than God had actually placed the priesthood, right? God had placed the priesthood under Aaron and his sons. They wanted to take it and just put it under the larger generic umbrella of anybody in the nation, right? We're holy. God is with us. Yes, God is with Israel. There's no arguing about that. There's no debating that. They certainly mix in a little bit of fact with their fiction. They mix in a little bit of truth with the distortion of the facts. But when they say, well, the whole congregation is holy, that is not the holiness. That is not the separation that God established in the priesthood. God had taken the Levites and had separated them, even from the firstborn, even from among the tribes of Israel. From within that tribe, there was one family that was distinct and able and qualified and called to be priests. Okay? So their thought, and they tried to make it a lot larger, right? Ye take too much, seeing all the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. We need to be careful, right? There's a lot of this today, and there's a lot of this in modern Christianity. Now, I'm gonna give the most obnoxious one, right? And use this comparison analogy or the comparison argument, right? The argument today is something like, why can't women pastor, right? And what is the argument? Aren't they saved? Aren't they gifted? Don't they have abilities? Aren't they true believers? Yes. Aren't women at times and often more spiritual than a lot of the men? Yeah. Yeah, all of that stuff is true, right? And yet when there's a smaller umbrella that God places under something, we want to be careful not to just, I think it should go under the larger umbrella, okay? If qualifications, if separations are given by God, we got to keep those things distinct, right? So I'm just using that as an analogy. I'm using that as a similar argument, right? Well, why can't this be this way? And it seems to follow that there are logical arguments why it should be this way. The problem is your argument is logical because you've divorced it from the umbrella God put it under. Keep it under those terms and conditions, keep it under those qualifications, and certainly the arguments that they would have had seem to cease. It's not all that long ago that God had separated the Levites for a special cause. And I think everyone recognized that. So that's their rebellion. That's the first 3 verses. Now let's jump down into verse 4. Let's start with Moses' response. It says there in verse number 4, when Moses heard it, he fell upon his face. Now that's an interesting response, right? Before he even answers them, before he gives them an individual face-to-face answer, he's going to fall on his face. The indication there, of course, as you know, who Moses needed to talk to first. Verse number 5, and he spake unto Korah and unto all his company, saying, even tomorrow the Lord will show who are his, and who is holy, and will cause him to come near unto him, even him whom he hath chosen will he cause to come near unto him. Moses' reply is that God will show who are his. Now, Moses is not entertaining the idea that, maybe you guys are right. Let's ask the Lord and see what he decides to do. No, God has already determined. God had already called the Levites and from them Aaron and his sons to be priests, right? That Moses is not seeing if God will reevaluate his call. Moses is letting them know God will confirm. God is going to show who are his. Now this is what you need to do, verse number 6. Take you censers, Korah and all his company, and put fire therein, and put incense in them before the Lord tomorrow. And it shall be that the man whom the Lord doth choose, he shall be holy. And again, that's not the word that we would say is like saved or sinless or anything like that, but sanctified, set apart to the office. Ye take too much upon you, ye sons of Levi. Moses lets them know they were really the ones that had gone too far. Same language, right? You guys have gone too far with this. Now God will show who are his. And the way that he'll do that is, take your censer, and the censer was the vessel that they would use to burn incense, and they were to put fire, and they were to put incense on it. That was symbolic of prayer, symbolic of an offering being made and rising up to the Lord, right? And that rises to the nostrils of the Lord as a sweet incense, as a sweet smelling savor. Language is used in the New Testament. And thereby, God would evidence. There would be an evidencing of whom the Lord had set apart for this office. Moses doesn't stop there. But he says in verse number 8, Moses said unto Korah, Hear I pray you, ye sons of Levi. Seemeth it but a small thing unto you that the God of Israel hath separated you from the congregation of Israel to bring you near to himself, to do the service of the tabernacle of the Lord, and to stand before the congregation to minister unto them. Moses reminds Korah, who was a son of Levi, and those from the sons of Levi that had kind of joined with him in this little mini rebellion, that it actually hasn't been that long since God separated your family to his service. Now, there's a lot that's wrapped up in that idea of verse number 9. And there's a lot that's wrapped up in it because when we go through the scriptures and when we read through the Bible, we would generally pass over all the details that are involved in what Moses is mentioning here, right? And because that's mentioned in the first 4 or 5 chapters of the book of Numbers. We often skip over those, or we don't necessarily retain a lot of that information because it's a lot of numbers, it's a lot of counting, it's a lot of just tribe names, family names. It's some of the more difficult reading as you read through the scriptures, right? Well, there's actually a lot of information that is in Numbers chapters 1 through 4, and lest we hop back and forth, I actually want to give you guys a little bit of chart. So Ben asked for a little help, a little handout before, and I'm going to give you guys this so that we don't have to skip around the first 4 chapters of the book of Numbers, okay? Because it's a lot of information, but it's good stuff. And I want to show you kind of how this is plotted out simply. If you look at it on paper, Numbers chapters 1 through 4 deal with the counting, right? The numbering of the children of Israel, the numbering of each tribe, and then the orders for the march and orders for the camp of the children of Israel. Now, what I have laid out for you here is in detail of how Israel would march. And again, all those details, we could read them verse by verse, but I think seeing it on paper like this is probably easier. This is how Israel would march. Now, there were 12 tribes plus the tribe of Levi. And you'll notice that as they camped and as they journeyed, they all camped and journeyed together in 3 tribe packs. The camp of Judah would have those tribes. The camp of Reuben, the camp of Ephraim, the camp of Dan. That's how those 12 tribes would be organized. Among them, though, would march the tribe of Levi. The tribe of Levi was divided up by who Levi's son was, Gershon, Merari, or Kohath. Now, Kohath is where Korah would fall under. Kohath is where Moses and Aaron and their descendants would go under. Now this is basically how they would march, right? The pillar of cloud would move, these camps and these tribes would go in this order. The Bible tells us that for the descendants of Levi, the Gershonites, the Merarites, the Kohathites, they had a very specific set of responsibilities. They were given the order and they were given the official working of all things related to the tabernacle. God's house, right? So you can kind of see here, and I have in parentheses listed out some of the things that were their responsibilities. The oxen and wagons, the things that they had to transport, to carry these things through the wilderness. When Moses looks at Korah and his son and his family, ye sons of Levi, here's what he says. Do you think that it's a small thing? Seemeth it but a small thing that God has separated you from the congregation of Israel? Now, Korah wanted to continually put, things under a much larger umbrella. And God tells Korah, or Moses tells Korah, that God separated you and gave you a tremendous responsibility in his service. I didn't necessarily want to hand draw a bunch of copies of this, but I also have an image of the camp, of how the Israelites would camp around the tabernacle, and they would camp with all of these tribes. And what you'll see there is that those descendants of Levi got to camp right next to the tabernacle. They got to camp right close to the tabernacle. And when Moses gets this question, when Moses sees this rebellion starting to form, it's really obnoxious that the main perpetrator is what? Is a Levite. It's someone from the tribe of Levi that, God has already separated. God has given a great responsibility to. You guys have the responsibility of helping and assisting Aaron. And when it's time to march, you all have the responsibility of, what do the Kohathites have? The responsibility of transporting important vessels, the setup, the teardown of the tabernacle, the helping with all things related to the service of God and the service of these instruments. So he says there in verse 9, was that a small thing to you? Seriously? God took your family and separated you to this service. You didn't think that was a big deal? You didn't think that was good enough? He says that in verse number 10, and he hath brought thee near to him. They got to camp closer to the tabernacle than anybody else did. And all thy brethren, the sons of Levi, with thee, and seek ye the priesthood also. God has given you so much. God has given you great blessings. And again, if you skip over or lose in the repetitive readings of the first few chapters of Numbers, you could miss a lot of that good stuff. That these families in Levi were given huge responsibilities when it came to God's house and God's service. Most likely that wasn't enough for you. Seriously, you're going to rebel just because you didn't get the priesthood? Because you're not the one making the sacrifice? Because you're not Aaron and his sons? You have totally discounted and you've totally made it seem a small thing that God gave you all of these great blessings and responsibilities in his service. We struggle with that, right? When we often focus on everyone else, we lose perspective. Or we look at maybe what everyone else is doing and the things that they're involved in. And, sometimes there's a jealousy, sometimes there's a desire or a want to do that. And then in doing so, though, we discount our own place, our own service, our own responsibilities, the blessings that we have and enjoy in our own place. If they would have thought, for 2 seconds that, as a descendant of Levi, I've already been called. I've already been separated to God's service. But there's no being content with their place. There's obviously a forgetfulness that God had separated them to do the work of his service. and they just come to Moses in anger and in rebellion, and you guys set yourself up over us. Like, did we not read that the firstborn belonged to the Lord and God took the Levites instead of the firstborn during the life of Korah? This is not something that happened years and generations before he was born. This is something that happened during his lifetime, that God took him and his family and established them in his service. You get no account of gratefulness. There's no real good perspective about place. Verse 11, for which cause both thou and all thy company are gathered together against the Lord. What is Aaron that ye murmur against him? Moses is clear that you came against us, but this is against the Lord. You know, what's Aaron? You say you're complaining about Aaron and how we've all elevated ourselves here. No, this isn't about Aaron. This is you being unhappy and discontent with your place that God has given you. This is murmuring against the Lord. And now in verse number 12, he goes to deal with those that aren't the Levites. Moses sent to call Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab. We remember from verse number 1 there, from the tribe of Reuben. But their answer in verse 12 is, nah, we don't want nothing to do with it. We will not come up. Is it a small thing that thou hast brought us up out of a land that floweth with milk and honey, to kill us in the wilderness, except thou make thyself altogether a prince over us? This is one of the most obnoxious things anyone has ever said. Okay? Anything that's recorded in the Old Testament is one of the most obnoxious things, right? They accuse Moses and Aaron of bringing them out of a land that floweth with milk and honey. This is the first time anyone has ever referred to Egypt in such glowing terms, right? That I don't think that that's how we recall the situation in Egypt when Moses led them out. You've brought us from a land flowing with milk and honey to kill us in the wilderness. And if that wasn't enough, it says there at the end of verse 13, was it a small thing that you did that, except now you make yourself a prince over us? Not only did you lead us from a great place to a terrible place, now you've exalted yourself over us. Moreover, thou hast not brought us into a land that floweth with milk and honey. The place you sold us, the place you told us about, what you sold us on, that doesn't exist, does it? You're not going to lead us there. You haven't brought us that way or given us inheritance of fields and vineyards. Wilt thou put out the eyes of these men? Moses, you're just trying to blind people. This is a diversion. This is a tactic. You're trying to get people to not see your failure in leading us thus far. It's pretty intense, isn't it? This is obnoxious talk that these men are absolutely rebelling against the leadership, against who God had put in charge. And everything that they say in these verses, not only is it not true, but it just sounds bitter. It sounds angry and arrogant. It doesn't sound logical in context of actually the facts. It's just terribly obnoxious. And so verse 15, it says, Moses was very wroth and said unto the Lord, respect not thou their offering. I have not taken one ass from them, neither have I hurt one of them. This is an interesting verse to me. Usually, when Moses is praying for people, what is he praying for? He is interceding for them, right? They rebelled against Moses, they rebelled against Moses and God at the mountain and had a golden calf made. And Moses prayed for them and spared them. God was ready to destroy them. Moses interceded from them. It seems like maybe they forgot that part, right? When they challenge Moses, when they rebel against him, they're not thinking of the time that Moses actually spared all of them, saved every one of their lives by praying for them. Well, in verse 15, Moses prays for them again. But this is where intercession works the other way. Because now Moses says, God, don't respect their offering. In other words, what have we already been told? Here was the challenge. Moses tells them, here's what you need to do. You need to go get your censer. You need to get fire and incense and burn it thereon. And then he goes and tells God, God, don't respect it. Don't recognize it. These men that come and they have their offering and they have their incense and they have that which they're going to burn on their censers, don't give it any mind at all. Don't respect their offering. And he mentions in verse 15, he prays this to God. Of course, God knows this, but prayer is just an honest confession at times, right? I haven't done anything wrong to them. I haven't taken of them. I'm not taking one ass from them. That's an indication that he was not abusive of his leadership or authority at all. He has not used his power to manipulate or to gain for himself. And neither have I hurt one of them. So, Lord, respect not thou their offering. That's intense too when you think about the one person that has been interceding for you and the one person who has been praying for you from the very beginning. Now he's praying for you again, but it's in the negative. Lord, they're going to bring these offerings. They're going to put fire and incense on these censers. Just don't even worry about it. Don't even think of it. And this is where we see the confrontation, beginning in verse number 16. Moses said unto Korah, Be thou and all thy company before the Lord, thou and they and Aaron tomorrow, and every man take his censer. Put incense in them, and bring ye before the Lord every man his censer. 250 censers, thou also, and Aaron, each of you his censer. And they took every man his censer, and put fire in them, and laid incense thereon, and stood in the door of the tabernacle of the congregation with Moses and Aaron. Now, this is what Moses told him to do, right? Bring your censers. And you and I both know now that Moses has prayed, Lord, don't even look at it. Don't even respect it. In verse 19, Korah gathered all the congregation against them unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, and the glory of the Lord appeared unto all the congregation. And the Lord spake unto Moses and unto Aaron, saying, Separate yourselves from among this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment. This is when the Lord comes, and the Lord is giving his answer. Moses said, the Lord will show you, the Lord will determine, the Lord will show you who is his. The Lord will show you who's holy, who he's separated for this office. And when the Lord comes down in this passage, he tells Moses and Aaron, just get away from them, because I'm going to consume all of them. I'm going to consume all of them in a moment. And they fell, verse 22, upon their faces and said, O God, the God of spirits of all flesh, shall one man sin, and thou be wroth with all the congregation? And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the congregation, saying, Get you up from about the tabernacle of Korah, Dathan and Abiram. And Moses rose up and went unto Dathan and Abiram. The elders of Israel followed him, and he spake unto the congregation, saying, Depart, I pray you, from the tents of those wicked men, and touch nothing of theirs, lest ye be consumed in all their sins. Moses goes to the congregation, and he basically tells them, those guys' houses and their tents, you might want to step back. You might want to get away from this place. Something's getting ready to happen. In verse 27, they gat up from the tabernacle of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram on every side. And Dathan and Abiram came out and stood in the door of their tents, and their wives, their sons, and their little children. You would think something's going on when everybody's backing away from you, right? Everybody's moving away from your tents. And Moses said, Hereby shall ye know that the Lord hath sent me to do all these works. I have not done them of mine own mind. If these men die the common death of all men, or if they be visited after visitation of all men, then the Lord hath not sent me. Moses tells everybody, get back from their house. Obviously a warning sign that something's getting ready to happen. And then he loudly proclaims, if nothing happens, then you'll know that God has not sent me. They've challenged us. You'll know that we're not the ones, and I'm not the leader. if nothing happens to these men. If these men die in old age, if life continues on as normal and the normal visitation of men happens, then you'll know I'm the fake, I'm the fraud. But, verse 30, if the Lord make a new thing, something you haven't seen before, and the earth open her mouth and swallow them up with all that appertain to them, and they go down quick into the pit, then you shall understand that these men have provoked the Lord. And it came to pass, as he had made an end of speaking all these words, that the ground clave asunder that was under them, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed them up, and their houses, and all the men that appertained unto Korah, and all their goods. They and all that appertained to them went down alive into the pit, and the earth closed upon them, and they perished from among the congregation. This rebellion against Aaron and Moses was understood by the Lord and understood by Moses and Aaron themselves to be a rebellion against God. You and I have studied, we have looked at every passage so far that dealt with God separating the Levites, separating Moses and Aaron and their families for specific purposes. Korah was not content with his place. Korah had a huge role in God's service. Okay? We can't discount that. Read the chart. Read the first 4 chapters of Numbers when you get some time. Read how those families got to huddle and camp closer to the tabernacle. Read how they got to be intimately involved with the service of God's house. And that it wasn't enough for them. They were not content with that. They had to rebuke and challenge Moses and Aaron. Now there's 2 different things here in this passage that Aaron and Moses specifically, but Aaron as well, when they pray that the Lord give recognition. Lord, when they bring their offering, don't recognize it. Show them to be who they are. Show us to be who you've called us to be. And yet immediately, when the Lord was ready to take the entire congregation, what does it say in verse 22? They fell on their faces. Aaron and Moses were not content that God destroy the entire congregation for what a few people had done. They are still praying. That's the mark of a good intercessor. That's the mark of a good high priest, like Aaron had learned and was learning to become, right? That in the face of being rebuked and challenged, he still loved his people and prayed for them and did not want God's judgment to come as so severe, to affect those that weren't responsible, to impact those that hadn't done anything wrong here in this case. Lord, can one man sin and be wroth with the entire congregation? He intercedes that God would spare the majority for what this minority had done. Through this passage and more that we'll talk about next week, because we're out of time today, Aaron continues to respond as this passage continues, and they are continued to be challenged just a little bit more. You would think that this episode that we've read today would be the end of the story, that people would look at that and say, yep, okay, we're done talking. We ain't got nothing else to say. It's evident that Aaron has been established as God's high priest. Moses has been established as our political leader, as our savior from Egypt and deliverer into the promised land. You would think that it would stop there. People have a hard time knowing when to quit. And yet Aaron will continue to show himself as a faithful high priest through all of these things. All right, Father, we're thankful to come